This week on the APUSHow, we will talk about Chapter 11, Cotton, Slavery, and the Old South. We'll look at the cotton economy. What role did cotton play within the Southern economy? Would it be totally dependent on cotton, or would it diversify? We'll look at white society in the South, and if we're looking at white society, we'll probably also talk about white supremacy in the South. However, we'll see that not all whites were indeed created equal in the South, as there was plenty of exploitation within the white community as well. We'll also look at slavery, the peculiar institution. What was so peculiar about it? Was it weird how awful it was? I guess we'll find out soon. And lastly, we'll look at the culture of slavery. Slavery is one of the most important aspects of American history we can understand today, and to understand the culture that it created is to understand the American experience. All this and more this week on The APUSHow. Famed Southern author William Faulkner once said, "The past is never dead. It's not even past. And try as we might, despite our best efforts, we never really escape the consequences of our past." On a lighter sense, think about if you go to bed without washing the dishes. You'll wake up the next morning with a dish full of dirty dishes. Whereas if you had washed them the night before, your present would not nearly be as full of dirty dishes from your past. Well, slavery and racism are issues from our past that we still live with and will continue to live with, and it doesn't look like we'll escape those anytime soon. The fact is, we were a slave-owning nation before we became a democratic nation, and despite how much we loved to celebrate our American system of Republican democracy, it could not end slavery. It took a civil war to do that. As we saw back in Chapter 2, slavery would beget racism after Bacon's Rebellion showed wealthy Virginia planters the dangers of a united working class. Virginia planters would establish slave codes that would split working blacks and whites in the South by giving privilege to one at the expense of the other. What made American slavery especially peculiar and unique compared to other systems of slavery in human history is that the system of slavery in the U.S. was one of the few slave systems in the history of the world in which the children of enslaved people would also suffer the same fate as their parents. Slavery would be further entrenched into American societies when these same slave codes were protected within the sacred supreme law of the land, the U.S. Constitution. Before the Civil War, we see many leaders and founding fathers feel uneasy about this immoral institution of slavery, but not enough Americans were willing to stand up to those who perpetuated and profited off of the institution of slavery. Whether it was George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, John Jay, James Monroe, or any other heralded white figure from our nation's founding and early days, all of these white men share the fact that none of them were able to do anything to improve the lives of black people in this country. And we need to realize that though Africans living in the United States were not made legal citizens of this country until the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, they were then, they are now, and they always have been Americans. And though their history as Americans is often unpleasant to look at, as this chapter will show, their history could arguably be the most important history for us as a nation to understand, and the reason why is simple. So few Americans today fully understand or appreciate the history of African Americans, and it shows. And so we begin this chapter with a look at the economy behind the South, which by the 19th century was all about cotton. In fact, one could say that cotton was king. And in fact, that's what people called it, King Cotton. The tobacco economy of the coastal regions had failed to generate the profits like it did in the 18th century because tobacco exhausts the soil something fierce, and the tobacco market fluctuates terribly, which means that a lot of people got out of the tobacco industry. Other industries like rice and sugar were profitable, but very difficult to get started, and both crops are very labor-intensive to grow. There was also long staple cotton, which is easier to process than short staple cotton, but the long long staple cotton doesn't handle varieties in climate or soil very well. Enter short staple cotton. Short staple cotton grows great, but making it ready to be used for textiles was tough because of its sticky seeds, which were difficult to remove. Well, thanks to Eli Whitney's cotton gin, those seeds were no longer a problem and the Southern economy was effectively saved. Who knows what could have happened had the gin not been invented? The South may have had to become like the North and diversified its economy away from agriculture and towards more creative avenues like manufacturing or shipping or something different and really cool that we'll never really know about. Regardless, short staple cotton production was immensely profitable. The emerging textile industry of the North needed it, and the soils in the newly acquired lands like Alabama, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi were perfect for growing it. And since the government successfully stole all that land away from the Native Americans who had been living there and forced them west and out of the picture, it was there to be settled by whites and used for cotton production. Between 1820 and 1850, the South expanded cotton production from 500,000 bales a year to 5 million, a nearly nine-fold increase. And by the Civil War, cotton was bringing in nearly $200 million a year for the United States and made up about 67% of the U.S. exports at that time. With these profits came massive migration shifts as poor and rich Southern whites clamored to claim land in the South for cotton production. It was somewhat similar to a gold rush in a lot of ways in terms of the intensity of acquiring land that was insanely profitable for white people. Black people who were enslaved migrated there too, but not by choice. The slave population boomed in the lower South, that is, the regions further inland from the coastal regions which made up the upper South. The lower South saw slave populations increase more than tenfold between 1820 and 1860. What's also interesting to note is that since the slave trade was abolished in 1808, almost all of these enslaved people were born in the United States and fulfilled a vital role in producing a crop that made up 2/3 of all U.S. exports. But these enslaved Americans obviously saw no profit from their labor. In the South, cotton was certainly king, but very much to a fault. The economy of the South was very one-dimensional and completely dependent on the production of cotton. One-dimensional economies generally don't work that well. The society depends too much on that one thing, and if that one thing fails, everyone is screwed. Also, what usually happens is a few people control making that particular product of the economy, in this case cotton, and it is really hard for anyone else to get in on that economy. This was the case for the South. Everything revolved around cotton and those who were most successful at producing cotton. The manufacturing sector was very weak, perhaps laughably weak compared to the northern manufacturing sector. There was also a class of doctors, lawyers, editors, and other skilled professionals in the South, but they were all heavily dependent on the southern cotton economy. The only people who could compare with the cotton planters in terms of power over the economy were the brokers who helped sell the cotton for the planters. The cotton had to be sold, and these brokers would broker the deal between whoever bought the cotton, which was usually a northern textile manufacturers, and the people who grew the cotton, which were the southern planters. This gave the brokers a good deal of leverage in the southern economy, and what added to this was that these brokers often were the southern bankers as well. The South, like much of the country, had a very disjointed and rudimentary banking system. Thanks, Andrew Jackson. So the brokers were able to fill this void. And banking was very necessary because the prices of cotton often fluctuated, and when it fluctuated downwards, cotton farmers went in debt, and the brokers were more than happy to step in. In addition to a crummy banking system, the South also had a crummy transportation system. You may remember from Chapter 10 that the North invested a ton of money in developing canals and railroad networks to integrate the people and economies living there. Those canals and railroads did not extend to the South, as the South didn't really see the value in upgrading their transportation networks. Roads were very poor, and most planters shipped their goods by river or by sea, which is why in this map you see of a bunch of cotton plantations in Louisiana that are long and skinny. This was so that everyone had access to the river because the river was the only good way to transport cotton away from your plantation and make money. The bad Southern banking, transportation, and manufacturing sectors would create a situation in which the South was heavily reliant on the North for pretty much everything except, well, cotton. Kind of like how William Howard Taft here is dependent on me for everything except for the production of cat hair, as he is a prolific producer of cat hair. No, Taft, I do not want more cat hair. I think I have enough. A prominent advocate for Southern economic independence came from James B.D. DeBow, who published a magazine called DeBow's Review, in which he advocated the South end its colonial relationship with the North. Ironically enough, DeBow's Review was published and printed in the North because no Southern printer could print and circulate the magazine well enough. This meant you had a magazine urging for Southern economic independence from the imperialist manufacturing North that featured a ton of ads for, you guessed it, products produced by the imperialist manufacturing North. So why did the South fail to modernize its economy and assert itself from the North? Why were the two regions so different in terms of their economies? Like most answers in history, there isn't a single answer for this, but there are some different ideas presented by historians. One reason is that the South made a ton of money off of cotton and agriculture and didn't really need to diversify its economy. The North, however, saw their agricultural economies decline in the 18th century, so they had to be creative and develop manufacturing in order to make a living. To many Southern farmers, the Southern agricultural economy wasn't broke, so they didn't see the need to fix it through modernization. Another reason was that Southern planters invested a ton of money in their enslaved workers that they didn't have a whole lot of extra money to invest in transportation or manufacturing. There was also an idea that climate played a role. Some historians have argued that it was too hot to build railroads or work in factories in the South, though the South had no problem doing this sort of work during World War II, so that idea kind of stinks. The other idea is that the Southern cavalier way of life wasn't really in tune with the cutthroat, hyper-aggressive capitalism of the North. The cavalier image is what we often think of the traditional antebellum white Southerner that is more concerned with a slower-paced, genteel, Christian, and refined way of life, sort of the antithesis to the fast-paced life in northern cities. And this cavalier life was definitely a white image, which brings us to the section of the text that discusses white society in the South. Just as the South was heavily stratified by race, it was also heavily stratified by class. The antebellum South didn't really have much of a middle class like we see at this time in the North. Generally, if you were white, you were either rich or poor, and based on the numbers, you were in all likelihood going to be poor. In 1850, of the 6 million white people living in the South, only a quarter of them owned enslaved people or belonged to families that owned enslaved people. The image of a large plantation and dozens, if not hundreds, of enslaved people was not the norm for most Southern whites. Most slave-owning whites had only a few enslaved people working for them. The famous planter aristocracy dominated political and economic life in the South. They had almost all of the wealth and held most of the power. They would build palatial estates and keep sometimes hundreds of enslaved Africans as workers and servants. They would take trips to Europe to escape the isolated life on the plantations and host opulent social gatherings. The South liked to perpetuate an image that their planter class was a sort of American version of European aristocracy, when in reality that was very much a myth. Most plantation families were pretty new to wealth and weren't that far removed from a life of wilderness and struggle on the frontier. And the idea of plantation owners sitting on verandas, sipping mint juleps all day and doing other rich white Southerner things was largely a myth too. Running a plantation required a great deal of effort and supervision, as managing enslaved people is actually a lot more work than one might realize. So much work that many Southern labor economists wondered if the South would be better off using paid laborers rather than enslaved people who had almost no incentive to work hard for their masters. In addition to managing the labor of the plantation, managing the sale of cotton required the same sort of cutthroat capitalistic efforts that one would see in the North. As many planters in the more inland states in the South were new to wealth, their desire to perpetuate the image of an easy, genteel life was more to keep up appearances than a genuine reality. We see the wealthy Southern value system reflect this Southern genteel image. Engaging in work like commerce or trade was seen as coarse or vulgar, and if one didn't become a planter, he would engage in a military career. Remember, these people thought of themselves as the American version of aristocrats, so the idea of knighthood was a big thing for them. Joining the military was like becoming a knight, and we see a lot of parallels in the code of chivalry from the medieval European knighthood with the ideas of Southern chivalry. Perhaps the biggest parallel between medieval knighthood and Southern chivalry came in the often violent defense of honor, or what we now call the cult of honor. Southern whites were obsessed with honor and the idea of keeping it. One's honor meant that one composed himself and treated others with Christian dignity, grace, courtesy, generosity, and class. As long as you were white, of course. Remember, they sort of thought of themselves as aristocrats, so they had to behave nobly. However, there was a vicious side to this. If a chivalrous Southern man felt he were disrespected, he felt within his rights to inflict great violence upon his offender, especially if the offense involved a lady. For instance, when Senator Preston Brooks felt his honor insulted by Charles Sumner on the Senate floor, Brooks did what any self-respecting Southerner would do. He beat Sumner mercilessly with a cane to the point of causing brain damage. Duels were also common in the antebellum South, even after they largely ended in the North. Andrew Jackson was actually in many duels throughout his life. And what better way to squash the beef than to take a few paces away from one another and shoot at each other? Taft? Taft is really into biting. It's actually super annoying. He loves to bite, sometimes even when he's happy. The Southern lady, meaning the wealthy Southern white lady, was a lot like the Northern white lady, except she got to do even less than her Northern counterpart. Southern women almost never held jobs, were rarely allowed out in public, and were seen as subordinates to be protected by the men in their lives. As the cult of honor was such a big thing in the South, naturally women were seen as needing to have their honor defended no matter what. Perhaps we see the idea of subordinate women summed up in the words of the Southern social theorist George Fitzhugh when he said, "Women, like children, have but one right, and that is the right to protection. The right to protection involves the obligation to obey." Wealthy white women had other burdens besides being nearly powerless to white men, in that their birth rates and infant mortality rates were way higher than in the North. So that meant a lot more getting pregnant and having more of those babies die not long after birth. And there was also the thing that many women had to endure their husbands engaging in sexual activity with their enslaved females. This is sort of the R-rated truth to slavery in the United States. Slave-owning males took advantage of the enslaved females frequently, which often meant they raped their enslaved women. Making matters worse is that when these women gave birth to these half-white, half-black babies, the babies would also be enslaved, and the white Southern women would face a constant reminder of their husbands' wretched and downright evil behavior whenever she looked upon a light-skinned African-American child among the enslaved workers. However, I do want to make it clear that no one suffered more than the women and their children who were born from these instances of sexual abuse. It's important to realize that not all wealthy Southern white women bought into this system. A very small number of Southern women spoke out against slavery, but most white women in the South did what most privileged and powerless humans do. They enjoyed the relative privilege they had, they reinforced their position in society any way they could, and they tried to think of ways to justify why they had so much at the expense of so many who had so very little. However, when we talk about the genteel, cavalier South, we're mostly talking about a very select and very privileged few. Most white Southerners did not live this charmed plantation life. In fact, about 75% of Southern white families owned 0 enslaved people. And we see this gulf between rich generation poor whites in the South grow in the 1850s as the number of non-slave owning families grew much faster than the number of slave owning families. And again, no real Southern middle class to speak of at this point. Educational opportunities in the South were the worst in the nation for most of the people that lived there. Obviously, formal schooling was off limits for the African American population, enslaved or not, and most whites also had limited access to schools. Elementary and secondary schools, basically K through 12 schooling, were fewer in number than the Northeast, but only slightly worse than the schools in the Northwest, which is the area that we today call the Midwest. Colleges were numerous in the South, and over half of all college students in the country attended college in the South, but most of these schools were out of the price range for most Southerners. It's also worth noting literacy rates in the South were the lowest in the country during this time. So one may ask, why didn't more whites resist the Southern slave aristocracy that gave them so few benefits? Why weren't there more whites who resisted and protested this unfair society? Even Taft here can recognize injustice as he feels his new diet is incredibly unjust. No, Taft, you're too chunk, and currently we are employing some tight, de-chunkifying measures to decrease your chunkitude. Some whites did resist. For example, the hill people, that is, people who lived in hilly regions like the Appalachian Mountains, the Ozarks, or other backwoods areas, did resist the Southern cotton aristocracy. Sometimes these folks are referred to pejoratively as hillbillies, and usually that name is given to them by people with more money than them who don't necessarily like their lifestyle. These people mostly lived subsistence lifestyles, meaning they farmed and produced enough for themselves and little else. They owned almost no enslaved people, resisted sectional conformity, and had an intense loyalty to the nation as a whole. These people generally resented planter aristocracy, would often refuse to join the Confederate Army when the Civil War broke out, and some would even fight for the Union Army. But aside from the hill people, most whites in the South had at least a tacit acceptance of the social hierarchy of the South, and the book mentions 5 reasons for this. 1, most whites depended on the planter aristocracy as a means for their own meager economies, whether it was providing some sort of market for their modest commercial agricultural ventures, or providing a rudimentary system of banking, or providing access to necessary machine capital like cotton gins, metalworks, or mills. 2, kinship was more extensive in the South, so a lot of times you had the situation where maybe the poorest farmer in the county was a cousin of the wealthiest planter, so they kind of had to stick together because they're family. 3, political participation was very strong among Southern whites, as many whites voted and attended political events in greater numbers than the North. Participants in these events came away with a feeling of unity with others who participated in the political process. 4, paternalism was strong in the South, meaning the idea that males are supposed to protect and provide for their families was a big thing, oftentimes to a fault. There's a difference between providing for and protecting for one's wife and family and creating a situation where males are given total control over their families and society. This would make it easy for leaders in the South to unify Southern white males under the idea that any attack on their society, which usually came in the form of attacks on slavery, was an attack on the society itself. The message went something like this: first they'll come for your slaves, next they'll come for our society and our family. And this was the basic logic behind their argument. But considering the society was based on an intense system of subjugation and exploitation via paternalism and racism, I'd say it was pretty ripe for attacks. Taft? Whoa, that's pretty extreme. Wait till you hear about John Brown and what he tried to do. And the 5th and most important reason that Southern whites didn't have a great deal of class conflict was because of the powerful unifying force of racism. Maintaining a society based on the belief in white supremacy required the vast majority of white Southerners to buy in and maintain this system. Nearly every white person was taught as soon as they were a sentient human being that they were superior to black people, and this superiority must must be maintained, defended, and cherished as a birthright. Whites sincerely believed that no matter how bad their lives could be, at the end of the day, at least they weren't black. And this sense of superiority unified whites and gave them a sense of duty to uphold and maintain whiteness, even if they were getting completely screwed by rich white people. And that brings us to a discussion on the lives of the enslaved. The South would call slavery the peculiar institution, and by this they meant that slavery was unique rather than strange. However, we will see that the South's commitment to slavery was rather peculiar, as it was one of the only regions in the hemisphere at that time that still practiced slavery. Brazil, Puerto Rico, and Cuba still practiced slavery at that time, and Brazil would be the last country within the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery when they did in the 1880s. We will also see how the relationship between blacks and whites was rather peculiar. Slave society forced whites and blacks to live separately and create different cultures and societies, and yet these societies were closely bonded and interdependent despite their segregated nature. In terms of the legality of slavery, slavery was permitted by the Constitution and further codified via state and local slave codes. These laws were pretty clear. Slaves couldn't hold property, couldn't leave their master's premises without permission, couldn't congregate with other slaves except at church or under the supervision of white people, couldn't carry firearms, couldn't attack white people in any circumstance, including self-defense, could be beaten to death as punishment, weren't allowed to be literate, and couldn't testify against white people in court. Also, only black people could be enslaved, and you were considered black if you had any trace of African ancestry. Needless to say, they didn't really know about our distant Homo sapien ancestors who all migrated from Africa, and thus all of us, to a degree, have some African ancestry. You're African too, Taft? I thought you came from a barn in Wisconsin. Well, would you look at that? Look at us. A couple of African Americans, except not really, not in any sense, because of the way our society works and how it perceives things. I am very much a white man. Taft is very much a white and gray cat, and we have to endure all of the privileges and prejudices that come with our race designation and our species designation. Now, one may think that with all these rules, slave life was very rigid, but as we shall see, enforcement of slave laws was very uneven and selectively enforced. Some enslaved people lived very harsh and restrictive lives, whereas other enslaved people had a great deal of freedom. Whites who only had one enslaved person working for them may have had a more equal relationship than perhaps a large plantation owner who had many enslaved people. The relationship between whites and the enslaved was almost always paternalistic, which means one could have a slave master that was a kind and benevolent type of father, or one could have one of those evil, abusive fathers that keeps their children in cages and does awful, ghastly things to them, or somewhere in between those two paternal extremes. Which brings us to the systems of slave labor. There were two major systems of slave labor, task and gang systems. The task system was fairly common on rice plantations where slaves would have a job or task to do for a day, and once they did it, they are free to do whatever they want. So an enslaved person may be asked to overturn some soil, clear some trees, plant some seeds or whatever, and then they could do whatever they wanted once they were done. Usually enslaved people would go off and tend to their own farms or gardens to grow their own food, which they would often try to sell or just produce for their own families. The other system was the gang system, which is what we more commonly associate with slavery. The gang system was more widespread in cotton, sugar, and tobacco plantations. Enslaved people would be put in groups to do work and would be supervised by an overseer who could be white or black. Why would a black person oversee and punish other black people? Well, power and authority can do awful things to people, and many people would jump at the chance to gain privilege at the expense of others, which is true of any race. As you can imagine, slave life was usually very harsh. Slaves were given the bare necessities to live and work. Their food and clothes were very cheap, their homes were often simple shacks, and medical care was very poor. Their labors were daily and began at sunrise and often went past sunset, with an increased hardship around harvest time. Enslaved women had it especially rough, as they not only had to work for their masters, but also had to tend to the household tasks like cooking and cleaning for their own families. They also took on the role of single parents, as fathers often lived on other plantations or were sold off to somewhere else far away. This also necessitated the unique and loose system of non-biological kinship, as a person's biological family may have been sold off or may have passed away due to the high slave mortality rate. Enslaved people were way less healthy than most whites because they lived in forced poverty. Many African American children did not reach adulthood due to disease. However, America was the only country that saw a natural increase of the enslaved population, meaning people increased the population through childbirth and not immigration. This goes to show that in reality, the system of slavery in the United States may not have been as cruel as systems of slavery in the Caribbean or South America, which almost never experienced natural increases in their slave populations. But by any measure, American slavery was still intolerably cruel. It's also worth noting that some especially dangerous tasks in the South would be given to hired help, usually in the form of Irish workers and not enslaved people. So clearing a swamp riddled with malaria would be given to a worker working for a wage. The logic being that if the wage worker got sick and died, you could just hire a new one. Whereas if your enslaved person got sick and died, you lost the money you spent purchasing said enslaved person. Enslaved people who worked in the master's house as maids, cooks, butlers, nursemaids, coachmen, etc. were known as house slaves. Their work was usually less physically demanding as the field slaves, and they sometimes developed close and affectionate relationships with the white family that kept them enslaved. But they often experienced a great deal of psychological abuse as well. They were under greater scrutiny from the white family as they were in closer proximity, and their transgressions were more noticeable and were more heavily punished oftentimes. In addition to this, female house slaves were often the victims of sexual abuse and rapes from white males in the house. There were no laws to protect these women from this abuse and from the backlash from the spiteful white wives who resented their cheating husbands and the enslaved women with whom they usually forced into sexual exploitation. White women would often heap on greater abuse on these sexually exploited women through increased workloads, beatings, and other assorted psychological torments. Which brings us to slavery in the city. Slavery in the urban South was remarkably different than slavery in rural areas, in that enslaved Africans in urban areas had more autonomy. Enslaved people were more difficult to be kept under control by their masters, as they frequently interacted with free black people that also lived in the city. Enslaved African Americans were often contracted out to perform manual labor, as there was not much of an immigrant class to perform manual labor like in the North. Quite often, slave owners would sell enslaved men to prevent an urban slave insurrection, with left a great deal of enslaved women and few enslaved men. This would create a situation in which many African American women and white men would engage in sexual relationships with one another and birth a great deal of half African, half white children, commonly referred to as mulattoes. However, mulatto is not really a term one should casually use, as it's seen today as quite problematic. There were a few free Africans that lived in the South. These were people who generally earned their freedom because they were able to market a skill in the city and could buy their freedom through what they earned, but this was pretty rare. There were some enslaved people who were set free by masters who had a moral objection to slavery. In some places like New Orleans and Charleston, there were free black communities. However, that would change in the 1830s after slave rebellions and white abolition inspired whites in the South to tighten restrictions on free black communities. This meant more supervision by white authorities, fewer allowances for blacks to congregate, and the process to free one's enslaved people was made much more difficult, if not impossible. The vast majority of free Africans lived in abject poverty, as they were denied access to most jobs in the South. Free Africans in the South experienced greater poverty in the South than they did in the North. Which brings us to the slave trade, which was an essential aspect of the business of slavery and one of the most morally repulsive aspects of it as well. The whole process was dehumanizing and foul. Enslaved people would often be transported in coffles. That's where they would take enslaved people and chain them together and make them sort of walk in a line. And these slaves would then be exchanged in central slave markets in places like New Orleans, Natchez, Mississippi, Charleston, South Carolina, and Mobile, Alabama. The price of a healthy male field hand could range between $500 and $1,700 depending on how the market fluctuated. When we adjust for inflation, the price of an enslaved person was about the same price as buying a car today. What made the slave trade particularly disturbing is how dehumanizing it was. Families of enslaved people would be split up and sold away from one another for the sake of control and profit. Children would be separated from their parents. Families that had been together for their whole lives could be split apart if an estate was split up after an old master's death. And the slave trade was just deplorable to the point where planters would look down upon slave traders, but still had no problem in keeping people enslaved themselves, of course. Though the foreign slave trade was supposed to have ended in 1808, that didn't mean that slave owners still didn't conduct illegal smuggling of enslaved Africans well after that. There was even a concerted effort in the 1850s to nullify the law that barred foreign importation of slaves. However, the foreign slave trade was met with resistance, as was the case in the Amistad case. African slaves brought from Africa led a mutiny on the Spanish ship the Amistad, killed most of the ship's crew, and tried to go back to Africa. Unfortunately, the Africans had no experience in sailing and ended up in Cuba. Thanks to the efforts of abolitionists and John Quincy Adams, the Supreme Court was convinced that because the slave trade was illegal, the slaves would be set free. They were brought back to Africa thanks to the funding from abolitionists. Slave mutinies were rare but important symbols of African resistance. And the subject of enslaved resistance is often poorly understood. There has been a great deal of historical debate regarding the effects of slavery on the enslaved. Some Southern apologists have argued that most enslaved people were content with their situation of being enslaved and were usually well taken care of. However, this is a pretty ridiculous argument when one considers the reaction to emancipation and freedom was usually one of exuberant joy, and the fact that there were countless instances of resistance to slavery in a variety of forms. If slaves were so happy with being enslaved, then why were they so happy to be free, and why did they resist it so much? The most extreme form of resistance would be the rebellion. Two notable rebellions, the rebellion of Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey, were both stopped before they could get started. However, Nat Turner, an enslaved preacher, led a band of Africans who armed themselves with guns and axes and went about the Virginia countryside in 1831, killing 60 white men, women, and children before they were overpowered by Virginia militiamen. Turner's rebellion was the only large-scale slave rebellion in the 19th century, but the fear it created within the white slaveholding community was fierce. The less extreme form of resistance was in the form of escape. Some slaves managed to escape to free areas in the northern United States and to Canada, like the 300 slaves Harriet Tubman helped escape. But Harriet Tubman aside, the chances of escape were small. Most enslaved people didn't know the geography of the United States all that well, so they would get lost and captured by slave patrols. And by the way, slave patrols were an early form of Southern law enforcement whose effects we actually still see in Southern law enforcement practices today. Who would help hunt down escaped people with the help of bloodhounds? Even with the help of white allies in the Underground Railroad, which was not really a railroad but a metaphor, the chances of escape were pretty small. The most common form of resistance occurred in the everyday. Daily defiance was the most common means of slave resistance. Breaking tools, intentionally doing a bad job, pretending not to hear instructions or orders, stealing little things from the master or the master's house, anything to make the master's life as difficult as possible without resulting in punishment. These acts of defiance would create a stereotype of black people as being lazy, but in reality, this perceived lazy behavior was really defiant behavior in the face of oppression. There were some Africans who adopted the Sambo mentality, which is the compliant slave who smiles, sings, dances, and acts cartoonishly dumb to appease white masters. The Sambo Act was a minstrel show-inspired facade to placate white masters, and many blacks adopted it. It's a relatively understandable behavior to act the way one's oppressors wants you to act, because it would oftentimes make one's life easier, even if it made it much more humiliating. Though resistance is an important aspect of the African American response to slavery, adaptation was incredibly important, and it's important to note that resistance and adaptation to slavery are key roots for African American culture in the present day. The first enslaved Africans came from all over Africa and had a great deal of difficulty communicating with one another as they spoke many different languages. They would adopt a shared language of a few selected words from their African languages, as well as English. As time went on and new generations of Africans were born, never knowing the African tongue, English was more widely spoken, but with a unique African American dialect. Perhaps just as important as language was music. Vocal music was and is a key fixture in the African American experience, as enslaved Africans often sang as they worked in the fields, where they sang songs with relatively harmless words. However, in their own religious ceremonies, enslaved people would sing music rich with politically challenging intonations. By the 19th century, most slaves were Christian, either by force or through missionary efforts. You may recall that the Second Great Awakening had a profound impact on communities of enslaved Africans. African American church services were oftentimes led by white ministers, but as slavery expanded, African Americans would lead their own services as well. Natural leaders in the African American community would rise to the rank of preacher. The services were much more animated than their white counterparts, with African American church members engaging in call and response type preaching, chanting, and spontaneous exclamations from the congregation. The message of the service often centered around themes of deliverance, being called home, or finding freedom in the promised land, and a great deal of emphasis on the story of Moses delivering the Israelites from slavery. These were themes of emancipation, of course, but slave owners would typically interpret these as simply biblical themes focused on salvation and God's grace. And though enslaved people weren't legally allowed to be married, the most common family unit in the African American society was the nuclear family unit of husband and wife that we see typically in white families all across the United States at this time. Enslaved women usually became pregnant earlier than white women did, but such a thing wasn't as Enslaved African American women became pregnant before marriage much more frequently than white women, but such a thing wasn't nearly as taboo in African American society. When African Americans living in slavery did get married, many of them stayed married their whole lives, even if they had to meet in secret or with their master's permission because they were from different plantations. However, many marriages were broken up due to circumstances beyond the bride and groom's control. Nearly a third of all marriages between enslaved African Americans were split up because of the slave trade. The average enslaved African American could expect to see 10 or more relatives sold away, and the most common reason for escape was to find and reunite with a family member who had been sold away to another plantation. Because of this, extended kinship networks were of great importance in the African American community. An enslaved African could have several aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, and others who held these roles even though they weren't necessarily biologically related. These extended kinship networks were a necessary means of survival and support for enslaved people who often found support nowhere else. Apart from the sale of family members, whites also intruded on black family life from the sexual advances from predacious slave owners who knew that enslaved women could do very little to stop them. When these half-white, half-black children were born, they were consigned to a life of slavery even though their father was white. However, as much as enslaved Africans hated slavery, the paternal relationship between masters and slaves somewhat complicated those feelings of resentment. Because enslaved people received food, shelter, and protection from their masters, there was a feeling that the master was sort of a father to all the slaves. And remember, for many slaves, they knew no other life but the life of being enslaved. And sometimes the masters could function as a father who could be harsh or kindly depending on the circumstances. This paternal relationship took a bit of the sting out of slavery, which benefited one race at the expense of the other. However, this didn't stop the vast majority of enslaved Africans from valuing the prospect of freedom any less or being any less jubilant when they would become emancipated. We will look further into the effects of the evil institutions of slavery and racism, as they will prove to be just as a part of the American DNA as democracy and freedom. As I've said before, we are a large, multitudinous, and complex nation full of contradiction. I can't think of a greater or more critically important understanding of our nation than our contradiction in which freedom and slavery are such crucial aspects of the American experience. Thank you guys so much for watching, and don't forget, we gotta keep pushing, G.